Today I'm looking at people issues of post-lockdown, and I'm going to give you some tips and help you prepare a return to work strategy. So we're starting really to see some possible light at the end of the tunnel, and I appreciate that it's very early days. Minds really are returning to the possibility of businesses being able to reopen, and they're starting to think about that, what that might possibly mean for them and how they'll manage that process. And we're already starting to see some businesses reopen in the UK, such as B&Q and Pret a Manger and Burger King, and lots of businesses in the construction sector. And where a cautious reopening has really worked quite well is where businesses have engaged with staff and have been able to put in place social distancing measures quite successfully, and they've agreed those in advance with staff who's really understood what they're doing when they're going back into that workplace. There's understandably a lot of debate at the moment and speculation as to how the government might actually approach the relaxation of the lockdown measures. Certainly we expect that to be implemented gradually and implemented by way of a phased system, but it's possible that rather than approaching it on a sort of strict sector by sector approach, it might be that the type of work and the nature of the workplace are significant. So for example, a shop will be different from a call centre, and a factory will be different from a sales team or an oil rig, for example. And if this approach is taken, I think there will be a lot more freedom within the framework provided by the government. So this will require a lot more trust in employers to be able to assess the risks that their employees might face in the workplace before they even contemplate reopening. And we can certainly see from other countries already that businesses really do need to tread with caution here. So Amazon in France have already failed to recognise its obligations in regard of the security and health of its workforce in respect of physical and social distancing, hygiene and cleaning of warehouses, and the courts ruled against them in that regard. And also we've seen a number of claims, perhaps not so unsurprisingly, in the US but also Australia, raising questions of worker compensation if there's a requirement to be in the workplace and that leads to an employee contracting COVID-19. So what are the steps that you need to be thinking about? Well, firstly, and perhaps most obviously, a risk assessment. You need to be looking at the risks posed by your premises, your working conditions, and also the makeup of your workforce. What steps can be taken to reduce those risks, and where steps can't be taken to reduce those risks completely, then is the business comfortable that the level of risk it is taking is appropriate and necessary in the circumstances? And I'd certainly suggest that you document the outcomes of that, but also the decision-making processes that you go through to get to that point as well. You then need to think about how you're going to communicate that to your staff effectively, particularly given that your staff are largely going to be away from the workplace, and also a number of staff might be on furlough leave, so that's going to make them a bit more difficult to contact, and it's certainly going to slow down the process even if it doesn't stop it completely. And the right way to communicate that message to your staff might be a video message from the boss, or it might be emails or online training, or perhaps a combination of those. But certainly a member of staff knowing that your employer has a plan in place to protect your health, and understanding crucially what part they play in that, and also what part others will play in that, it's likely to give them real peace of mind. And that importantly will protect the business going forward, because an employer may be liable if an employee's health is damaged due to a colleague's disregard of health and safety rules, for example. So you need to aim to get this out as early as possible and make your communication transparent as possible. And if you can get the employee's feedback and ask them to input into the process, then even better. These steps will prove helpful for you later down the line, for example, if your employees do object to returning to work. The next step, unfortunately, involves you delving into the small print of your insurance policies for this one. So you need to check whether you have appropriate insurance in place to cover the risks of health and safety related claims that you may face from your staff. And you also need to check whether you should actually be flagging your plans for reopening with your insurer before you actually go ahead with those. You then need to rethink about your working practices. So do you and should you be going back to work as normal pre-COVID-19? And in the majority of cases, the answer is going to be no, certainly in the short term, and possibly also in the longer term as well. But the starting point has to be who actually needs to be in the workplace and also who can continue from working from home. And if you've not already had to go through that process already, identify those roles that are really business critical. And like you may have done with furloughed staff, how are you going to make that decision whilst avoiding any claims for discrimination or other issues of unfairness which could then later on lead to claims? So where you have a choice, are you going to either ask staff to volunteer where they want to be returning to work, or actually are you going to direct your preferences as a business on your staff? And I think either approach is absolutely fine, but you just need to plan for that and what your communications are going to be to staff around that point. And if it is the latter, so that you're going to direct on employees more what your preferences would be, then your considerations should certainly include protecting those staff with underlying health conditions, those with perhaps a long commute, particularly where that might involve public transport, or those that might have ongoing caring responsibilities. And certainly at that point, the issue with regards to schools and whether or not they reopen may be a factor in play there. If you have furloughed staff and the government scheme is still in place, then issues may arise when it comes to reopening for some employees who are working and for some employees who are on furlough. So, for example, a difficult situation to deal with might be where you need staff to come in off furlough, but there's not enough full-time work for them. So, for example, you might have a restaurant that's up and functioning again, but only open, for example, at the weekends. So this could mean placing staff at a financial disadvantage by being asked to work. And it certainly would under the existing scheme, but it may be that the government does introduce a scheme that accommodates a partial return to work, and certainly that's what a number of people are expecting, but it's very much a matter of watch this space. But assuming that the scheme remains as it is, you might in that case want to consider whether or not rotational furlough leave could be used in 3-week blocks. And often, or as we've seen on businesses closing down who've gone into the furlough scheme, that's been seen largely by employees as a fair way of dealing with the situation. But you do have to bear in mind that that might not be the best way for the business to deal with it. So you really do need to weigh up the pros and cons of that for the business. So moving on, what strategies can you put in place to minimise the risks of cross-contamination? And also, what operational lessons can we learn from those businesses that have remained open or those that are reopening now? You could consider staggering starting and finishing times to avoid people commuting in peak periods. Where possible, you might want to encourage staff to walk or cycle into work, or possibly to car share, but that really is only going to be an option when, for example, you're doing it as an alternative for people avoiding busy public transport. And if so, then they really need to obviously be sharing the car with the same people that they had been, rather than mixing that around. So thought really needs to be given to how people are going to be getting into work, because as much as you can put the measures in place at work, that sort of negates all the good work you might be doing there if they are, for example, jumping on the tube or a busy train. So in some cases, for example, you might want to consider whether or not it would be appropriate to arrange some sort of private transport for those staff that are required in the business. You might also consider extending your opening hours, so perhaps rotating your working patterns for a period, or limiting the time people are in the office, so reducing the overall number of people that are in the office at one time. And also think about whether or not you're going to require staff to notify you when they are in the office or when they intend to be in the office, and how that process might be managed in practice. You might also want to consider restricting access to areas of the business where maintaining social distancing is going to be problematic. So, for example, you might be able to ensure that desks or working areas are adequately spaced, and you could perhaps introduce a one-way system around the office like we've seen in supermarkets. That works quite successfully, but despite being able to do that in some areas, there will be some places in the workplace where you simply can't do that. So, for example, communal kitchens, toilets, staff rooms, things like that, or areas like that may need to be cut off altogether, or the numbers of people going into those spaces limited. If it's the latter and you limit the number of people going into those spaces, then you do need to ensure that after, appropriate periods that you have people coming in to clean those spaces where, cleaning surfaces that people might have touched. You might also want to think about adapting the workplace. So you could, for example, add screening or perhaps create work pods for people to work within. And how long that might take will need to be factored into your strategy, and equally how you're going to source the materials for doing that. Something that we've been asked quite a lot about is the wearing of personal protective equipment, so specifically face masks. And although the health advantages of wearing those, or certainly the government hasn't necessarily promoted the wearing of those in the workplace, certainly, employers, I think, are going to want to consider that, certainly at the request of their employees. I think that's likely to be something that lots of employees will ask for on reopening. That's likely to be a bit of a tough one for employers, certainly in the short term, because, well, for starters, you may have difficulty sourcing the PPE. But secondly, assuming that you can source them, then you don't really want to be seen to be taking away the PPE from frontline staff. So at the moment, there's a bit of a drive for businesses to be producing non-medical grade PPE for businesses to use, which is distinguishable from the medical grade equipment. And I think that certainly will prove particularly helpful when businesses start to reopen. Other measures you might want to take include keeping face-to-face meetings to a minimum. So if you haven't got it already, then you need to be researching and getting the technology in place to support video conferencing. And workplaces where equipment or desks are communal, so they're shared, so people don't have fixed workplaces, they may want to reconsider their working practices, at least for the time being, so that people stick at one workplace and don't move around. Or if they're going to keep it as it is, then again consider the deep re-cleaning after every change in user. That's going to become essential. Testing is something that a number of clients have raised, and when it comes to testing, employees absolutely can be asked to do their own voluntary and confidential testing, and certainly we've seen that businesses have chosen to have electronic temperature readings on the entry to buildings, and staff have voluntarily taken their temperature at that point, which is absolutely fine. If as a business you want to have more control, so for example if you want to introduce a mandatory testing process, then there are a number of hurdles in terms of data protection and contractual issues that you'll need to work through before introducing such a policy. And so this will take more time to set up, and probably is only something that you'll want to do where there's a real need for that. If you've reduced workforce in the office, you still need to make sure that you have adequate trained first aiders and fire wardens available, and therefore you might need to train some more staff now in advance of the lockdown easing. And there's a number of ways you can do this. There's lots of online training providers available to help you do that. Bear in mind there may be health and safety inspections by the HSE without warning. So also think about perhaps doing your own spot checks across your workplaces to make sure employees are actually understanding and following the policies and procedures that you're putting in place, and that they're working, that they don't need to be reassessed in light of, when things open up and staff come into work, actually it doesn't work as you expected. I think that would be a sensible approach to take. So once you've gone through your measures that you're going to implement, you really need to think about perhaps incorporating those into a policy. And that could be a discrete policy, I would imagine, because I think there's going to be quite a lot of detail here in these sort of cases. And that will be sent to staff in advance of them returning after the lockdown, so they can really digest that and know what's going to be expected of them on their return to work. It's also worth bearing in mind that the relaxation of restrictions will certainly not mean that we're out of the woods, and a second lockdown is possible. So you therefore need to be quite cautious about making any long-term commitments to employees. Make it clear that any return to work measures will continue to be reviewed and adapted and evolved as the government guidance evolves as well. I hope this has been useful. We've got lots more information available on our COVID-19 hub, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.